There's one thing that virtually every pilot is petrified about. What is it? What are the dangers? How can you prepare for it? That plus some personal stories coming up on Aviation Intrigue.
Aviation intrigue.
What frightens most pilots, no matter what they fly, large or small? The answer, believe it or not, is ice. And with the recent news of a Challenger crash on a snowy night in Maine, we know that icing can be lethal.
Yeah, this Challenger jet took off under, let's say, questionable weather conditions and unfortunately met a very tragic ending.
So, this was a recent accident, and so it's going to be under investigation by the National Transportation Safety Board for at least 1 or 2 years or more. But with the fatalities involved, they're going to be looking very closely at the weather conditions due to snow and ice and low visibility in the area, which can create icing on airframes, which is definitely dangerous, especially for takeoffs and landings.
So we know a little bit from reading the news and the reports that have come out that this plane did prepare for it. But before we get into it, is icing or structural icing, is that dangerous every case?
It kind of surprised people that something like that could cause such a fatalic tragedy, and the aircraft hadn't even left the ground yet. But it's absolutely true that when you look at the wings and the tail, the flight controls, the things that make an aircraft fly, changing anything on that, including contamination by ice, snow adhering to the wings, things like that, can definitely cause difficulties with aircraft lifting off. And it can cause difficulties in flight with creating weight, changing the shapes of the wings to the point where it affects flight. And so, for all phases, ice is a big vulnerability.
We actually have talked about this in previous episodes where even small amount of ice, sometimes just frost, is enough to change the aerodynamic characteristics of the airplane and sometimes to leading to these kind of tragic events.
That's true. And that's actually why there are federal regulations from the FAA that no aircrew is allowed to take off with known contamination of ice, frost, or snow adhering to the wings, tail, or other critical surfaces on the aircraft. And that will definitely be part of the investigation on the Challenger crash.
We know that it is frightening to be in icing situation. Later on, we'll talk a little bit more and share some personal stories. But in this particular case, the crew of this Challenger in Bangor, Maine, seemed to be aware of the weather conditions and, in fact, seemed to have even prepared for it properly.
It's definitely known that there was low visibility causing freezing moisture in the area and snow, and all of that can adhere to the wings of large jets. And so, if you've been on an airline or a charter flight, you may have seen de-icing and anti-operations taking place, and that's definitely a factor in what happened that night.
So when we say de-icing, that means it is to take off the ice that is already formed on the wings and the surfaces. And then when we say anti-ice, that is to prevent future ice from adhering to the surface of the aircraft.
So, if you've seen large trucks spraying fluid all over a jumbo jet or an airliner that you're about to board, that's exactly what's going on, either de-icing, anti-icing, or both.
So when we're sitting in the airplane and they come this truck and they kind of hose us, and in this case, it looks like the Challenger actually went through the same operations.
Yes, apparently the anti-ice operation definitely took place, as well as other aircraft who underwent that. But in the end, there are limits to this kind of fluid. You can spray it on, but it may only be effective for just a few minutes, and it may not always be enough time to take off.
And especially in heavy snow or heavy icing conditions, the time limits have to be very, very strictly followed. Otherwise, the effectiveness of the solution just kind of wears away.
Possible because there's evidence of other air crews and other aircraft declining takeoff. There may have been some recognition that the anti-icing fluids were losing their effectiveness, and in that short window before takeoff, it appears that there may have been some contamination, possibly on this aircraft, which caused it to be unable to lift off the ground.
Hindsight is 2020, but perhaps this crew should have made the decision to delay the flight to at least the next day after the icing event is done.
And that just shows how dangerous ice and snow adhering to an aircraft can be, and how critical the timing is, and how critical the judgment calls are in terms of whether to go or not go.
So, decision making is very critical. We call it ADM or aeronautical decision making. And making the right decision is so, so vital in most cases. And most of us are trained to make more conservative choices. If in doubt, stay on the ground.
That's definitely true. And it just goes to show that decision making takes place well before the flight as well as during the flight itself.
Later on, we'll talk about what about small aircraft and also our own personal stories. But what happens in flight? What kind of equipment do they have to mitigate ice while they're in flight?
So, higher performance aircraft and larger aircraft have a lot of ice protection equipment that will protect them in flight once they safely take off. How do they manage that? On the airframes, there are all kinds of equipment like de-icing mechanisms to knock ice off the wings, as well as heating elements that are all around the aircraft to keep those critical flight control areas from freezing, as well as the tops and leading edges of the wings that help create lift. And so all those areas that are critical to flight are protected that way.
It's the same as when I use my windshield washer fluid to melt the snow and ice that's formed on my windshield while I'm driving.
Sure, or like turning on the warm defroster for the windows, or some people have those available on the mirrors. And anytime you've got a warm element, you will have a way of keeping the ice off, as well as washer fluid, which generally tends to also keep that above the freezing level.
Three ways to get rid of ice. One is mechanical, break down the ice. Number two is chemical. So use some sort of chemical. That's kind of what we use in our windshield fluids. And then the third is thermal by heating the surface up and melting the ice.
Yes, and that goes for the windshields as well as the airframe, and those are all the options available depending on the type of aircraft.
So it is important to remember that even though all these technology is available, but sometimes the nature of icing or the severity of icing could still limit despite you having all these capabilities.
That's absolutely the case. So, in our original question, what about icing is frightening to most pilots, no matter the size and the capability of the aircraft they fly? That's because even with all this great de-icing and anti-icing equipment that can be used in flight, a lot of these large aircraft are still limited in what they can handle. There are weather conditions, let's say ahead of a big winter storm, that can create icing so severe and accumulating so quickly that even very sophisticated jets could not possibly keep the ice off. And so that's why air crews, no matter the size of aircraft, are very, very cautious about going through ice, and they will find ways to avoid it if it's that severe.
I've been in situations like that, thankfully, not in any dramatic conditions, but where icing is formed and the capabilities I had may be not as good in melting the ice. We'll talk about that later on.
Yes, as we mentioned, they take great care to make sure that there isn't ice, frost, or snow adhering to the aircraft before departure. And since icing encounters in cold, icy clouds is very common, and aircraft flying at high altitudes can pick up ice, they still have to exercise caution because their encounters are going to be much more frequent because they are on airline schedules and airline routes and flying at very cold altitudes.
Before we segue into smaller airplanes, the one that we fly normally, what can the pilot do to prepare for this? Are there reports? Are there ways to predict this?
That's a great question. Pilots flying aircraft of all sizes are trained to check the weather ahead on the route to get an idea of what the conditions are. And sometimes that's going to involve asking some questions about how cold is it at the altitude that we'll be flying with it? And is there a likelihood of ice occurring at those altitudes? Because there may be times when there are advisories of other pilots that you can read about before you go flying saying, hey, we're reporting that the icing was pretty severe between these altitudes on this route. You may want to avoid those areas. And certainly large aircraft will make a slight change in routing or altitude if they definitely want to avoid picking up anything be on a little bit of ice.
It's not that different than our own commercial weather forecast. It might say we're going to get 2 to 4 inches of snow, or we're going to get freezing rain or sleet. All those things apply, except they are much, much more critical in an airplane because they could bring down big airplanes without a lot of notice.
Like the Challenger crash that we discussed earlier, even taking off can be very dangerous, and encountering ice in flight at high altitudes is not quite as dangerous because you're very high off the ground, but you can accumulate enough ice to actually cause an aircraft to be unable to maintain its flight path or altitude, and that can even be with the icing protection measures we talked about because ice can accumulate very quickly in the right conditions.
When I was taking flight lessons, I was told by wise flight instructors to avoid thunderstorms and icing. How do pilots of small airplanes avoid and get around this icing?
So we touched on a little bit earlier on the fact that light aircraft don't have the very sophisticated ice protection equipment that large aircraft do. So if you're flying a personal 2 or 4 seat aircraft, like we train others in, you're going to have very little. I mean, some of them are just equipped with maybe a little bit of heat to protect the airspeed indicator and maybe some cabin heat and defrost on the windshield, and that is about it. So there's no way of protecting the airframe from ice, and so avoidance, I think, is what we're all taught.
Vast majority of small airplanes, especially the ones that people train in, are not meant to go into icing. They just do not have the capability to be in any kind of icing. Some airplanes do have the capability to get out of icing if you inadvertently end up in it, but most airplanes do not, and therefore it's a good idea to avoid it.
Yes, definitely. And even in the light aircraft category, you mentioned there are a few makes and models that have something like maybe a heated element propeller to keep ice off the propeller, or some fluid that you can squirt out on the propeller and the wings and the tail. But those are pretty small systems, and they're only going to buy you maybe a few minutes to get out of icing conditions. And by the way, we should mention that for aircraft of that category that don't have much de-ice equipment or anti-ice protection on board, it is actually illegal to knowingly go up into significant icing conditions with that type of lack of protection because it is so dangerous. So, along with the federal regulations in aviation for not taking off with ice, frost, or snow adhering to the aircraft, you are not supposed to be going up into what's called known icing conditions, knowing that there is ice up there and deliberately flying into it. And that's a really big deal when it comes to the FAA standpoint.
We call it flight into known icing, and only certain planes are even equipped to be able to fly into those conditions. But even then, it doesn't mean you launch into any kind of situation. It's very important to understand the weather forecast, understand the severity, and there's certain kind of icing that could make it a lot more difficult to recover from than others. So knowing where you are flying, knowing the temperatures, and most importantly, way to get out of the situation is critical in pre-flight planning.
That's definitely the case. So for light aircraft where we're not supposed to be up there in icing, sometimes you're going to inadvertently get into it because you didn't see it in the forecast and you were in an area where you maybe thought there weren't any. And I've definitely been in inadvertent icing a couple of times where you look out the window and you see icing forming on the fronts of the wings and on the tires, and that's your first sign to either go up out of the clouds or get down into warmer temperatures. And I've had a couple of instances of that happening. And the first thing you think of is, I've got to get out of here. And that really goes to show how quickly you've got to react.
So in this case, what did you do? What were your actions?
Well, in one case, we climbed up above the clouds. There were ice crystals forming on the windshield flying in the clouds in a small 4 seat aircraft. And this was during an instrument training flight where we were deliberately flying in the clouds on a trip to see what that was like. And a little bit of frost started forming on all the parts we could see. And the decision was, let's climb, because we knew that the tops of the clouds that would put us back into blue sky and sunshine to melt the ice off and keep it from accumulating anymore was just a couple of minutes climbing up. And so that was our escape route. And then the second time, occurred when the clouds were very, very wet. And then we flew on a trip into an area of colder temperatures. And all of a sudden, all of that froze onto the airplane. And we were in a small Cessna with no ice protection whatsoever. And the defrost was not keeping up. So it was actually getting hard to see. And we immediately asked air traffic control, we'd like to go down into warmer temperatures. So in that case, a descent was what we got to use to escape the icing.
So, in general, icing conditions are prevalent when you're in the cloud. So, just be able to get out of the cloud by either descending or turning around or even climbing, in your case, could avoid you from getting additional ice. But then the temperatures have to be right in order to melt the ice that you have already accumulated on your aircraft.
Yes, absolutely. And so the weather planning was really huge on those days because we knew that there may have been a likelihood of that happening. And we were not seeing any reports from anyone. So we thought, well, maybe it should be okay. But the further we went, the colder it got. And that was something that was unexpected because sometimes you get weather that doesn't follow the forecast.
And I've experienced a situation similar to this in one of my trips into Madison, Wisconsin, where there was a thick layer of ice, and a commercial airliner in front of me reported icing in severe icing that they were picking up. And I was above the clouds. And in that case, I just simply requested to stay high and descend through the ice as fast as possible to avoid picking up as much ice. And I knew it was clear down below. And when I landed, there were chunks of ice, but nothing to cause aerodynamic problems in the airplane.
That's great. You're able to get down into what an airliner called severe icing. I mean, if they're calling it severe, then it's really bad, and that means you can have rapid, thick ice accumulation in seconds. So luckily, you're able to get down safely.
This particular aircraft was equipped with icing protection, and that's why I was able to safely navigate through this. And it's very important to know the capabilities of the aircraft as well as the atmospheric conditions because things could change rapidly.
So it goes to show for planning and decision making. And I once also made a decision not to fly at all because there was frost all over the airplane when we got out there due to cold temperatures forming along the low elevation airport where the cold air settled. It got moist and it turned into frost. And we talked about the rules against that. And it was so thick that we couldn't even get it off with brushes and blankets. And so we had to cancel the flight that day because it would not have been safe.
Have you been in an airplane, an airliner, when the de-icing trucks are trying to get your airplane ready for flight? We'd like to hear your stories. And have you ever been in a situation or know of anybody who's been in an emergency situation that they had to descend and land because of icing? Tell us more. This program is for information and entertainment purposes and are not meant as flight instruction, legal, or medical advice.
This is aviation, aviation, intrigue.